Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Old Tunes Fresh Takes. We had such a great chat with John Wilks in our last episode we couldn't fit it all in, so we decided to release this mini episode so we could share the full chat with you. Let us know if this is something you've enjoyed. We're really keen to get more guests on in the future, so we want to know if it's something you guys are keen to hear more of too. If you still haven't heard our latest episode, including discussion of our versions of Geordie and versions sent in by our amazing contributors, there'll be a link to that in the description. Also in the description are links to our Facebook, Twitter and SoundCloud pages, so make sure you pop over and give us a like and a follow so you can keep up with everything that's going on. Right, let's get started.
Great, so we've got John Wilks in from the Old Songs podcast.
Hello.
It's very exciting. John, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm just fascinated with traditional songs. You know, most of my waking hours and probably quite a lot of my hours spent asleep are spent thinking about traditional songs and where they come from and who sang them originally, and why a song like the one that we want to talk about today, you know, was possibly first published in 1601, and yet here we are in 2020. Still fascinated by it.
Quite, yeah.
Great, yeah. Well, I guess our regular listeners will know that me and Jack are not particularly experts in the history of traditional song. So I'm sure you can hear exactly why we brought John on today.
Yeah, well, let me just say, I mean, I think there are far more expert people out there than me. I mean, I came to this only about 5 years ago to traditional music, but I came to it with a passion, and I as a former journalist, I just... You know, I wanted to learn about it and share what I was learning with other people. And so I originally started by writing a blog. I started recording albums of these songs, the ones that fascinated me. And in the end, it turned into a podcast, which was the Old Songs podcast.
Yeah.
And in the Old Songs podcast, basically, each episode is one of these songs, and we deep dive into it for... You know, it can be up to an hour and a half just talking about one song and where it came from and who sang it best and why it travelled and all of these kind of things.
What, Desert Island Discs do 6, do they? Forget, that's too many, isn't it?
That's far too many.
Hey, also, quick shout out for your album Midlife, which is a brilliant album, songs collected from Birmingham, isn't it?
It is, thank you very much. I didn't know you'd listen to
I sent it to my mum because she's from Birmingham, but I've been singing, I can't find Brummagem. It's wonderful, it's brilliant.
Thank you. I mean, that straight away with, you know, that's an example of one of the things that I know a lot of people find really comforting and fascinating about traditional songs is that you can geotag them, to use modern parlance.
Yeah.
And in some cases we know where they were found to within the location of the building. You know, it's not just like this song came from Rugby. It's like this song came from, you know, such and such a Builder's Arms pub in such and such a place. It's
right. So you just said 1601 for Geordie, this song.
I did.
I didn't have a year, but where's that from?
Jack. We'll get there, Jack. We'll get to that.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Go on. Take us on the journey.
When you go into old songs and traditional songs, naturally there is a tendency to want to know how old it is.
Yeah, for sure.
There's almost a competitive thing.
Yeah.
Is this an old one? Are we talking about an old one? Or is this some music hall nonsense from the 1870s? But yeah, this is one of the ones that you might call an old one. So it's got numbers. It's got a number that's Roud number 90. So Roud 90. And that's named after a guy called Steve Roud, who's still very much alive and very much doing stuff.
Yeah.
And he basically... In the 1970s, when he was a young man, started collecting references to traditional songs and keeping them on library cards stacked under his bed.
Right, yeah.
And then in the 1980s, he bought an Amstrad computer and uploaded it all onto the computer. And then he started working in the last couple of decades with the English Folk Dance and Song Society, which is kind of the central headquarters hub of where this kind of music is studied and looked at. And there's something, you know, there's somewhere around 250,000 songs that have been indexed largely by this man. Quite astonishing number of songs.
Yeah.
Roud is still alive. He still does his stuff. You can meet him at Cecil Sharp House in London. He's got a little... When I met him, he appeared to be living in a cupboard.
Okay. So it's way more comprehensive than the Child collection, for example, then.
Francis James Child, he was a collector. So collectors were people who went out into the rural communities or let's be blunt, into the working class communities and would go up to people and say, "Can you tell me the old songs from here?" And somebody somewhere would be able to sing unaccompanied versions, usually, of some of the old songs that were local to, or locally known and locally, celebrated and sung, often in pubs. Most people would not leave where they live. They wouldn't go more than a mile from where they lived in their whole life. It was very located. So you'd have songs. They didn't necessarily belong to that town, but the people of that town would have known them. In the town that I live in, Whitchurch here, we know that there were 11 songs collected from a very specific house around the corner here. And to this day, a lot of the older people in the town still know those songs and still recognise those songs.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about collectors. Now, a lot of them would go out, most famous one is probably Cecil Sharp.
Yeah.
And he collected something like 8,000 songs in his lifetime alone. Our image of him doing his work was that he would rattle off on his bicycle into the countryside and just approach people in fields and that sort of thing. There are great stories of people like George Gardner, who was another collector who was local to Hampshire. And there's great stories about him going up and knocking on the doors of people and saying, "Any old songs?" And people going, "No, thank you. We don't need any old songs here." And thinking that he was like trying to trade in them or something.
Yeah.
But Francis James Child, and Child is one of those names that crops up a huge amount. He was a desk collector, essentially, by which I don't mean he was collecting desks, obviously.
Right,
I mean, he was sat at his desk at university in America, and he was writing letters to people and saying, he was writing letters to communities in Scotland, in all sorts of places, and saying, send me your song, send me. And he was extraordinarily, prolific in terms of what he collected, and, huge, great volumes of songs and versions of songs. Yeah, so with Geordie as an example of that, Child registered 14 versions from Scotland and 2 broadsides from England. The broadsides dated to the 17th century. So a broadside was basically a printed version of a song that could be sold on a street corner.
Right.
Sometimes called penny ballads, but they were literally a broad sheet of paper that would have 1 or 2 songs on them. And, you would hear the singer sing them on the street corner, and that's how you would know the tune. So quite often there are hundreds of thousands of broadsides of traditional songs that don't have tunes, or they might have a reference at the top that says to be sung to the tune of such and such.
Right.
If you don't know what that tune is, then you've got no idea what to sing it to.
Yeah.
And the people would have heard it in the street and go, "Oh, I like that tune," because the singer would have sung it, and they might have sung it with a certain panache. And so you would go up and you would buy it, and then if you managed to remember the tune by the time you got home, then you could play that to your family.
So, quick question, sorry. The people who were selling the broadsides, were they also producing them? Were they independent? What was the industry there? I
mean, there was a huge industry around it. I have a book over there that's very. This is how geeky it gets. I have a book over there that somebody bought me for my Christmas present this year, and I value it hugely. And it's called Birmingham Street Ballads and Their Sellers, or something like that.
Right.
And literally, it's not even the street ballad. It's not even the song's lyrics. It's just a list of every Birmingham street ballad seller and the songs that they had in their catalogue to sell.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
That was a banging Boxing Day when I went through that. I can tell you. but the book is sort of 80 pages long, and it lists all these different street ballad printers. So there was a huge industry there. People would sell those, and then they would employ people to go out there and sing them and sell them on the corners. So it's unlikely that the printer themselves was going out and singing them on the corners. It was an industry.
Right, that's interesting.
And quite often when we talk about songs travelling, quite often they would travel at that point when we're dealing with the printing press. They would not be travelling through oral means, i.e. they're not being sung to one person who then carries them to the next town and sings them to somebody else, which certainly would have happened prior to that and continue to happen to a certain extent. That's what we call oral transmission. But in the case of the broadsides, quite often there's a good example would be there's a great song called The Birmingham Jack of All Trades. And in that song, every verse describes a street in Birmingham and what you could find on it. It's like the yellow pages in traditional songs.
Oh, interesting.
I've come across the Dublin Jack of All Trades.
And there you go. That's where I was going next. So
okay, yeah.
I don't know which one came first, but obviously it was so popular that some other printer somewhere else went, I'll have that.
Yeah.
That'll work, and I'll just
Right,
change
yeah.
all the streets. And
Yeah.
I think there's a London jack of all trades as well. So
Right.
so sometimes the songs would travel in that sense. And in the case of Geordie, you have quite a lot of examples of that happening too.
Yeah.
And so when we say, that we've got 14 versions from Scotland and 2 broadsides from England, those are just 2 broadsides that date to the 17th century, by the way. There would be far, far more broadsides.
Yeah.
And if you go to the library, the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library at Cecil Sharp House in London, I think I found 328 references to Geordie. So,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
so you can see, 382 references to Geordie. So even more.
Oh, wow. So that's so by traditional song metrics, that's a pretty popular one then.
There are bigger ones, but it's a big one, and it's and it's an old one. And what you find is a great thing that you can look at on that Vaughan Williams Memorial Library website is you can arrange the songs by Google Map, so it will show you exactly where it was collected. And as soon as you do that, it loads up, and you start seeing all these pins populating the map. And then initially, it's you see it travelling across England, and then you see it populates Scotland, and then kind of fittingly, it's like a virus. It suddenly jumps across to the States and to North America, and it populates that. Interestingly, where it is, so it goes sort of England, Scotland, the States. It doesn't seem to spend terribly much time in Ireland, so it's a weird one in that sense, because quite often you would find songs that sort of did the circuit, so to speak. To answer your question earlier, so I mentioned that it was 1601. That seems to be the earliest sort of printed version that has been found. So there's an early version that was found in the Pepys collection. So Samuel Pepys.
Oh, wow.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
He used to collect them, and so he found one that's possibly printed as early as the 1670s, where it was known as The Life and Death of George of Oxford. The earlier one that I mentioned before was probably as early as 1601, but could have been as late as 1640. It's not dated, so they haven't got an exact date for it. At that point, it had the especially catchy title of A Lamentable New Ditty Made Upon the Death of a Worthy Gentleman Named George Stool, Dwelling sometime on Gateside Moor and sometime at Newcastle in Northumberland, with his penitent end.
Oh, snappy. You know it's going to be a banger.
It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And somehow, and this is what I love about traditional music, somehow that has come down to Geordie.
Yeah. Which tells you nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you've got this song that's travelled a huge amount. It's travelled a lot through England. It's obviously been a broadside, which means that it suggests that it was popular enough that somebody wanted to print it, and then it's been collected as a broadside a huge amount, which suggests that in this in the course of its history, people have loved it enough that they've gone and printed it again and again, and it's travelled widely as well. But what's interesting, when we talk about 1601 there, and again, I have to caveat that point that it's possibly that old, and it's that particular broadside is possibly 1601, possibly 1640, somewhere between, but still old.
Yeah.
But that's at the point that it turns up in broadside. So that means that at that point, somebody has gone, oh, this is a good song. People are singing this, and they've printed it.
Yeah.
So we don't actually know how long they were singing it before, and it was travelling around in oral tradition before somebody took it upon themselves to print it.
Sure.
There's a theory that Georgie is a chap called George Gordon, who was known as the Earl of Huntley, and he lived somewhere around the mid 1500s. So,
right.
I mean, there's not a huge amount of evidence for that to be the case, but if it was the case, and it is about him, then it would suggest that could be a good starting point for the song.
Yeah.
But if it's not about him, and somebody's just attached that to him, it could be older. So it's hard to know.
This is really interesting, because we had a bit of a mid-episode, inter-episode crisis. Yeah, we basically realised that we had one version that we'd provided in our as a sheet for people to download and to learn the tune from, which Jack had put together. I was the one who suggested the tune initially, and when I went back and sort of listened to the version that I'm used to and the one that I'd come up with, I was like, this is nothing like the one that Jack's produced. The lyrics aren't the same, the emphasis isn't the same. We've no idea if it's supposed to be a rich man or a poor man, and there's all these really interesting questions, but it sounds like it's just been butchered by the centuries to the point where it's anyone's guess.
The question that I have to sort of ask you there is, these two tunes that you were kind of vying over.
Yeah.
Which two of the possible 58 were you listening to?
Right.
Because there was a chap called Bronson in the early 20th century who took it upon himself to try to document all of the tunes that would go with the child ballads.
Okay, interesting.
I think it's something as simple as, the tunes of the child ballads or something like that. For Geordie, he found 58 potential versions in melody.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating when you were saying that they would just sell a lyric sheet, essentially, is what we'd call it now, and say to the tune of this, and you had to know the tune. Because this makes me question about, so were people using this Bronson book?
Oh, well, some of them were. Some of them would have been. But I think it's a controversial subject within, the world of traditional music.
Yeah.
There are names that come up, and I'm not going to mention any now because I don't want to get into a fight. But there are names of certain people and scholars over the past sort of since the revival, who have a certain controversy about the way that they did things, and certainly within, say, the area that I've become interested in, which is Songs of the Midlands. That actually going to cut that out because Songs of the Midlands is a great book and it doesn't come into this controversial topic at all.
Okay, you want to leave that out. That's not.
Oh, this is saucy, John. Bring in names.
It's certainly not Songs of the Midlands. That's a great book. But there are books out there of collections of songs from the Midlands, in which when you actually go and start looking at them, you're like, this is an amazing song. Then you look a little bit further and it's like, hang on a minute, the author wrote this. And so you've got these sort of situations where you've got,
right.
Yes, these people collected and published in these books Songs of the Midlands, but then they would throw in their own just on the off chance that you might not spot it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Does anyone have that with YouTube playlists? When you get a whole album in a playlist and someone's just stuck their own tune in the middle,
Absolutely.
You're listening to an album. Oh God, it's awful. Someone's dance banger comes on halfway through a Radiohead album.
But it's a great, what you've got there is a really modern version of what we're talking about. It is the same. It's people. I'm sure I've been guilty of it. I know I've been guilty of it. Of creating Spotify playlists that might have one of my songs in there as well.
Right. Yeah.
It's how.
Well, it's the whole B-movie thing, isn't it?
Is it?
The old cinemas, you would sell the big film, but they'd always sell it alongside two or three others that weren't particularly acclaimed.
What are you
Those
saying?
Were the B movies.
What are you saying
Your
about
songs
my
are the B movies?
I'm not saying that you're writing B songs, John. I'm just saying that it's perhaps
So back to Geordie.
So.
What is quite clear is that there are two obvious routes to it, two distinct routes. In some ways, it can almost be seen as two distinct songs, but they're always married by a certain set of lyrics or a certain narrative point that just makes you think that you can't really separate these. They're just too similar.
Right. Yeah.
And I think you've got versions there. Certainly there's the versions that Martin Carthy, we just mentioned him. He sung a wonderful one in about in the early 70s, I forget the exact year, as a younger man, and then he returned to a completely different version as an older man. And I think that's a fascinating thing. I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly not uncommon in a traditional music career, perhaps, that you could do that you could actually record several versions of the same song or what's ostensibly the same song and have them sound unrecognizable to one another. Because He's picked 2 out of a possible 58 tunes there.
Yeah.
Is now a good time to have a quick listen to the earlier of the Martin Carthy
Go
version?
for it, yeah. I think it's on an album called Crown of Thorn.
Now as I rode out of a London bridge on a misty morning early, I overheard a fair pretty maid who cried for the life of a Geordie. Go bridle to me a milk-white steed, bridle me a pony. I'll ride down to London town and I'll plead for the life of me Geordie, for he never stole ox, he never...
So a few years ago, I was lucky enough to have Martin Carthy round to my house. Martin and Eliza, his daughter, were performing at the folk club that I run, and the next day Eliza had to go into London, and she said, I don't know what to do with my dad. And I said, well, I'll have him. And he came and we hung out for the day, which was extraordinary for me because I've been a huge Martin Carthy fan since I was about 17 years old. So it was really lovely to have him round. One of the things we talked about actually was Geordie.
Right.
His earlier version, the one we've just listened to, struck me so so hugely. He like slapped me by the side of the head when I first heard it. It was like, this is a mammoth song, quite clearly. And I asked him about it, and actually on my website, johnwilks.online, I've got the whole of the Martin Carthy interview that I did that we took 3 to 4 hours to do, and I've transcribed the whole lot. Should anybody be interested in Martin and what he thinks of his career and all of that sort of stuff. We went into quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, great.
And I asked him about Geordie, so I'll just read to you what he said about it. He said, John Pearce gave me Geordie in 1960. So John Pearce was a musician that he knew, who was a very kind musician. And he talks in the interview about how in the early 60s, because it was so hard to come by a song, you know, if you heard of a traditional song, it's not like you'd jump on Spotify or YouTube and listen to a million versions of it. You know, you had to travel. Sometimes, you know, people would travel down from London to Cornwall to pick up a song because they heard that there was some bloke who knew a version of such and such. You know, you had to have these kind of levels of passion.
Right. Yeah.
And there was one guy in London, John Pearce. I might be saying that wrong. Might be John Pearce. I'm not sure, but I think it's Pearce. John Pearce was one who was not precious about keeping the songs to himself. So quite often people would have a song and they would have it and they go, right, I'm keeping that to myself and I'm going to learn it and I'll perform it at gigs and this will be my signature song. And the only way that anybody's going to learn this is if they sit in the audience and try to memorize it straight out.
Right, yeah.
Which Martin told me he did used to do. He got to such a good point where he was able to go and listen to people. He would memorize 9 verses on one listening and go home and write it down. He got so good at it.
Cool.
So anyway, not the case with John Pearce, who was quite happy to hand out versions of songs so that other people could share them. And so he says, John Pearce gave me Geordie in 1960, I think, and I was very happy. It was my signature piece for a few years, and then I abandoned it after a while, thinking it was old stuff, and I just put it away. And then I got a chance to make a programme out of stuff for the BBC using their sound archives. And one of the recordings I used was of Louisa Hooper, who worked in the vicarage where Cecil Sharp first started collecting songs. So Louisa Hooper, she had a sister called Lucy White, and sometimes they sang together. So there are songs collected there from both of them. And there was this third sister called Lizzie. So there was Louisa, Lucy and Lizzie. And there's a recording of Louisa singing Geordie. Not in 1903 when she was first collected, but in 1940. So she's a much older person. And she's singing to a woman called Maud Carpeleys. And Maud Carpeleys was an assistant and collaborator with Cecil Sharp in collecting stuff and travelled with him quite extensively. And so she was singing to Maud Carpeleys, who was one of these slightly old school collectors who loved the tune but thought that the words were rubbish because they weren't literary enough for her. Yeah. And also this was the Scots version of the song. So the Scots stuff was considered very impressive because the language was beautiful. But English country singers stuff was considered less so. So when she was talking about, when Maud Carpeleys was chatting to Louisa, probably liked the tune but probably ignored the words. Anyway, look, Martin says, Louisa gets this verse, Geordie shall be hanged in the chains of gold. And she stops and she says, chains of gold. Now, there's hanging for you. And, you know, a tear came to my eye. In the background, Maud Carpeleys is saying in very prim and proper way, it's such a lovely tune, isn't it? And you're just sort of thinking, shut up, Maud Carpeleys, stop it. So, you know, he goes on to say that it was through hearing those recordings that it made him want to sing it again, and he started rearranging the tune, and it's that version, it's that coming back to it in the early 70s on the album Crown of Horn. Sorry, I said Crown of Thorn earlier. Crown of Horn. You know, he talks a lot in that interview about shifting the tonal centre. Clearly something that he was very, very proud of. And then as he got older, you know, he's obviously, it's a song that's hung around. And he's done a different version, which perhaps you can play now.
Yeah, absolutely.
For what has Georgie done and shoot his hair? Was it stealing or murder of any? Oh, he's told 16 of the Lord Judge's dear, and we sold him down under the valley. Oh, saddle him up, cries my lily white breast.
So that version he talks about, he learnt that from a chap called Levi or Levi Smith. And Levi Smith was let's call him Levi. Levi Smith was a traveller quite often with those sort of traveller songs, there's just something in them that can really hook you in, and sort of you'll often find that they literally, those songs have travelled and changed quite a lot in their singing. And he said, I heard Levi Smith and I'm thinking, what the hell is that? I listened to it again and again, and that apparently throwaway version of it, it's kind of speak singing. And by that time I'd listened to quite a lot of very old recordings, so my ears were getting quite sharp. And that's how you find stuff. Don't question what you're hearing, just absorb it, because those people knew what they were doing. And when I heard his brother singing it, he's singing the same thing, but he sticks in a couple of variations. That line, Geordie shall hang in chains of gold. It's all about paying attention to what people sing, especially the gypsy singers, because they're doing some amazing things. They sing the tunes that are handed down to them, but it's often in the cracks. That's what really works for me.
Right.
What he's talking about there is not just finding two versions of the song, but also how he's approaching the song as a much older performer himself, and also as a listener. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier. I don't want to say most people aren't, sort of mature enough to understand what they're hearing or anything like that, but certainly perhaps not patient enough to really sit down and go, oh, there's something there. There's something really interesting there that's not usual. It's not my usual, it's not my usual experience of listening to music.
Yeah, because I mean, music for a lot of people is very throwaway and very, it's something to have on in the background. And I've got a big playlist full of these kinds of recordings, and it's not the kind of thing that you listen to for comfort,
No.
You definitely have to be listening to it very deliberately.
You'll get there. One day. one day it'll be what you're, just throwing it on 9 p.m. at night while you're in the bath.
Yeah, and my wife will love me for it. So.
It's exactly that. It's exactly what you're saying. The idea that that music can be throwaway. That's not to say that I think that music in the days when these songs were being sung unaccompanied in pubs and what have you was necessarily something that everybody suddenly stopped and paid attention to. Yeah. Although there are some fascinating videos of sing-around sessions happening in a sort of the earlier part of the 20th century that you can find on YouTube, like sort of archivist recordings. And it does seem like those people are sitting around and they are listening very carefully to songs that one person or two or three people in the room might sing. And there is a sort of reverence for what's going on. But it's also quite possible that the reverence is happening because there's a BBC camera crew there. So you don't know kind of how natural it is. There's a great song that I love singing, and it's a song that I did on my last EP, and it's called Holly Ho. And it's from the Black Country. And the guy who collected that said that when he went there was a little stage in the corner of the pub with a little piano, and people would get up and sing and everybody would sing along. So there was a sort of raucousness to it that he describes that's not that reverential thing that we're talking about. What's interesting about that song as well, Holly Ho, is that it's what they said about it, what the collector said about it, was that every week somebody would bring a new verse to the pub.
Right, interesting.
So regulars would go away and contribute to the song, so that it almost competitively come back each week and try to have something that they'd written that would make the others laugh. And what we've got ultimately is a version of maybe six or seven verses, which are whittled down. They potentially could have been hundreds of these verses, but presumably the version that we've got that sort of has survived is almost whittled down in a sort of survival of the fittest kind of way.
Right.
Whereby these are the verses that people remember because they're the best verses. And you can't know that for sure, but you could certainly hypothesize that that's the case. And that's, I think, quite commonly the case. I mean, you made a little mention of it earlier, Tim, that perhaps the version that you're singing or the tune that you're singing are just the tunes that have become the better known versions. And yes, I think there is that case that you've got tunes that are quite often that have been selected by the masses and have been without people realizing that they're doing that in a very much survival of the fittest way, because the tune is just better than the other versions and more memorable. So more pleasing, or perhaps even more, maybe it's not that they're better, it's just that they were more, they had a kind of lowest common denominator effect going on, where more people would remember a certain tune than something a bit more complex.
Today we'd probably call it crowdsourcing or like meme. It's a kind of evolution now. I can see a parallel there.
So yes, it does seem that there are sort of two versions of it, essentially two versions of it that come from It can roughly be broken down into the English and the Scottish tradition. That's where those distinctions can be found. The interesting differences between the Scots version and the English are that largely the Scots version tends to end well for Geordie. He doesn't always hang in chains of gold or in fine linen thread. He's often saved by his beloved. That doesn't happen so much in the miserable English version, where he's nearly always hanged. In the Scots version, he's often a nobleman. In the English version, he's often an admitted criminal, but occasionally he's a noble criminal.
Right, yeah.
So there are these kind of little bits and pieces that sort of separate the two. But then, again, you start looking into it, and it's never that cut and dried. There's always the nuanced sort of aspect to it. The other version that I think is worth listening to is a version by my lovely friend Nick Hart, who records traditional music in such a wonderful way. He's a student of traditional music. He has a very similar problem with traditional music to I have, in that it keeps him awake at night.
Yeah.
And anybody who he happens to be sharing a house with.
Great, so we'll just have a quick listen to that now. This is Nick Hart with Georgie from his album Nick Hart Sings 9 English Folk Songs.
My Georgie never stole house nor land, nor has he murdered any, but he stole 6 of the king's wild deer, and he sold them in Fancany.
His was collected from a book called Folk Songs Collected in Cambridgeshire, which is a fairly sort of specific title.
Yeah.
It was compiled by a woman called Mary Humphreys, and Nick said Cambridgeshire is my home county. He doesn't specifically sing songs from East Anglia, but he's fascinated by them, and I think he's also attracted to that sense of place. So he will sing a lot of songs from that area, and he does a wonderful set of songs that came from the repertoire of a chap called Sam Larner, who I adore that guy. That guy's singing, long since gone, but a wonderful singer, and also somebody who was hugely important in developing Martin Carthy's interest in traditional music. So,
right.
A seminal figure that very few people outside of folk tradition would know about. But Nick says, Cambridgeshire is my home county, and this version comprises a tune collected in Foulmere, a mile away from my father's native village of Thriplow, and the words are from a Mr. Pamplin of Fenditton, where my auntie Nonnie lives. And then he just very basically says, I've removed 2 of the verses because I didn't like them.
Oh, great.
And that's the editing side of traditional music. That goes back a little bit to what you were asking earlier, Tim, about sort of, what people do with the tunes and how authentic they might be. And I was sort of saying, that these guys from the Midlands who would throw their own songs in and that kind of stuff. I think it's fine to take bits and pieces out of songs, and quite often people will come to traditional songs and find that that the sentiment of them doesn't fit with modern times, doesn't fit with modern sensibilities, and so therefore will make changes. And I think that's how the song lives, how it survives. To pretend that wouldn't have happened at some point in previous decades and previous centuries is a little bit silly, I think. I think there is a tendency for some singers to go to traditional songs and think this has to be sung exactly like in the way that I found it. So that essentially it's a museum piece, and that's just people making what I would think wrong assumption that people have left those songs in absolute intact since the day that they were first sort of magicked into existence. And that can't be the case. Traditional music and traditional songs is essentially a form of Chinese whispers.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way of looking at it.
It can't be the case. And therefore, Nick knocking out 2 verses because he doesn't think they suit the situation for whatever reason, that's fine. And, quite often, as I said before, you will come across songs that don't have tunes, and we don't know what the tunes are, but the lyrics just need to be sung, and so therefore you've got to find a tune, or you've got to write your own tune or something like that. And I think that's has always happened. So yeah, don't treat the songs like museum pieces. That's why I like what you guys do. I think there's a certain a certain reverence that you're bringing to the songs, and you're giving them their time in the digital spotlight in the way that you can. But you're allowing them to live and breathe, and you're bringing them to new audiences, and you're not treating them like museum pieces. You're doing something interesting with them. And I think it was Dave Swarbrick who played with Martin Carthy. I think it's him rather than Martin Carthy who said, the worst thing that you can do to a traditional song is not sing it.
Yeah.
Something along those words. I've probably misquoted them, but it's that sentiment anyway.
Oh yeah, this is a fantastic endorsement. I'll be turning your voice up through this section. A bit more echo. The voice of God coming.
Oh, don't do that.
Absolutely.
The voice of God would be someone like Steve Roud, sort of proclaiming from inside his cupboard. So.
Oh,
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
I think that's all I've got to say about Geordie or Georgie.
I think we've got far more than enough there.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to do a big
Good luck editing that down, basically.
Yeah, I'll do it. It's fine. Actually, I've got a quick question before we finish. Sorry. So you say there's two key versions where you've got the Scottish and the English version. What happens when it gets to America? Do you know much about that?
So
and which version is it?
That is an interesting thing, and again, that sort of slightly goes back to that rather sort of timely analogy to a virus spreading, a pandemic, if you will.
Oh God!
It's fascinating to me why a particular strain of a song goes somewhere else, and what the literature that I've been reading in preparation for this podcast suggests is that the Scottish version these days, when you come to traditional singers or people wanting to sing these songs, quite often they're going to pick up a Scottish version, because there's this kind of one way I saw it described was that the Scottish version has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's quite an important thing for a singer who wants to sort of really tell the story. And so the Scottish version seems to be quite popular at the moment, and there are some wonderful versions. And I know Debbie Armour from Bird Ellen has sung a version of this, and Debbie's somebody that you should get on your podcast. Bird Ellen, look up Bird Ellen. Yeah. She does amazing.
We heard her
stuff.
on your podcast.
Oh, there you go. Right, well, and she's I think far more knowledgeable than I am in terms of ballad singing. And when I mean ballad singing, I mean some of the really old songs, the big narrative ballads, the ones and certainly the Scottish ones, because that is her tradition and that's where she came from. So she does a version of it. I think she did it with, was her collection called The Green Ribbon, or the band was called The Green Ribbon? I forget what it is specifically. Sorry, Debbie. What's interesting, though, is that when the song crosses to America, what it seems to have been the case, and again, I'm no big expert on this, or I don't have a huge amount to back this up, apart from some reading I did based on an essay by Steve Roud on this subject, and he says that yes, it was the English version rather than the Scottish version that jumped over to the States. So if you go to the States, a lot of the versions there are the version that is not perhaps what we would now consider to be a more definitive version. So why did this is what I don't know the answer to this. Why did the perhaps more inferior version happen to cross? I mean, again, it goes back to that sort of viral thing, that pandemic thing. It's just that somebody or some group of people heard and knew that English version and happened to get on a ship and take it over, and it caught on in the States or in North America in that format. Then again, listen to Martin Simpson's version, and he's singing in a version on an album that I think he probably recorded in the 90s. He's singing a version which sounds a lot like it's from the American Deep South. It doesn't sound anything like an English or a Scottish song.
Right.
And so it gets around like a bug.
Cool. Right, let's wrap up, shall we?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, John. It's been really wonderful. I could listen to you talk all evening.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I have to just apologise for just sort of rambling and rabbiting and that. People always say to me, well, that's not true. People often say to me, it sounds I could listen to you all evening, and I really don't think they're being sincere. But thank you for saying it anyway. So,
well, it's been great having you on the show. And yeah, go and check out the Old Songs podcast and check out Midlife. It's a great album, and go and check out John's website for more writings.
Thank you, chaps.
Yeah, cheers, John.
Wow, what a lovely guy. As we said before, if you've enjoyed this chat, let us know, as we're very keen to have more guests on in the future. Don't forget to head over to our social media pages too and give us a like and a follow and stay up to date. We're really looking forward to our next episode on Young William. It's a song that raised some challenges, but that's never stopped our contributors before. If you want to get involved and have any questions, feel free to drop us a line and we'll be more than happy to help. So, see you in episode 6.